Very much. So the status of Islam in Europe depends largely of the status of religion in Europe. So we don't start, with a tabula rasa. We start with a political and cultural landscape, which has organized since centuries the place, the room for religion. And of course, we have many models. In Northern Europe, you have, and in England, in Great Britain, you have state church, an official church, although there is religious freedom for the other churches. In Germany, Holland, and Belgium, we have recognized religions, who benefit from some status from the state and some money from the state. In South Europe, we had a concordate, but it's finished. Italy is no more has no more a concordate with the Catholic Church. Also, in Italy and in Spain, the Catholic Church is still very influential and is playing a political role, even if it's not in the constitution. So France is a specific case because it's secularism in France is, I would say, not just legal secularism, separation of church and state, but it's also some sort of an ideological secularism. Secularism or laïcité is defined in terms of values of Weltanschauung, and not just, as a legal and constitutional principle. So in France, we have the most extreme version of secularism. Does this make France an exception, or does this make France the model of the way to manage Islam in particular and religion in general in Europe? That's what I will look at. Of course, the issue of Islam in Europe, the recent issue, is recent, specifically in Western Europe. Although Europe and Islam had a long tradition of historical relations, philosophical relations, and so it's part of history now. The real issue is the rooting of a Muslim population in Europe, and specifically Western Europe, from the 60s, in the wake of a huge labor migration. So that's the issue of Islam is not connected with the theological debates and so on. So it's firstly a problem of sociology. The coming of millions of Muslims workers into Western Europe from the 60s to the 70s. Of course, we have now new migrants, and many of them are Muslim, but we cannot speak of a Muslim migration. Muslim migration was a labor migration. That's something which is important. And this was in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. The problem of Islam as a religion started in the late 80s. Before that, it was not a religious issue. It was a migrant issue. The terms to qualify the Muslims were never religious. In Germany, they said the Turks. In Great Britain, they said the Pakis. In France, it was the Maghrebans, the North Africans, the Arabs, the migrants, but never the Muslims. It's only at the end of the 80s that the term Muslims tend to replace ethnic terms. And the reason is very simple. It's because during the 80s, we have the surge of the second generation of people who were born in Europe, whose real language was a European language, contrary to their parents, who were educated in Europe. And at least a part of them claimed to be Muslim. So they claimed a religious identity or a religious practice, not an ethnic identity. They didn't like to be called Arabs or Pakis or Turks. No. They say, I am a Muslim citizen of this or that country. That's the new phenomenon. At that time, in the 80s, we still had, a communist Eastern Europe, which means that the issue of Islam in Eastern Europe was not a model at all for the West. So, for instance, the fact that in Bosnia we have an old historical Muslim European community was not taken into consideration. It was not acknowledged. And I think that this gap, between the history of Islam in the West and the history of Islam in the East is still there. Except, of course, in the Balkans. But if you look at the debate in Poland, it's the same debate that in Great Britain, Germany, and so. Islam is assimilated with a recent migration, and not, with the history of Europe. In Poland, for instance, we have a very small Polish, Tatar, Muslim community, which is rooted in the history of Poland. But they don't play a role. It's even not acknowledged. It's even not known. Very few people know about that. Still we have this connection between Islam and migration. And in the mind of the people, it's still there. It's still very, very important. How Europe is managing the issue of Islam as a religion. As I said, it's recent that the perception that we have an issue with a religion and not just with migrants is from the late 80s, early 90s. And it's specific of the countries which have a tradition of labor migration. So France, Switzerland, Germany, Belgium, Holland, Great Britain, and the Scandinavian countries. In Italy and Spain, the labor migration is very recent. Until the 80s, Italy and Spain were countries of immigration. Spanish people and Italian people were still migrating. And it's only from the 90s that we have a first generation Muslim population in Italy and Spain. So the problems are slightly different. But in all the cases, the issue is what is the status of Islam as a religion. And here, the big debate is what do we oppose to Islam? What is the ova of Islam? Many people think that Islam is the ova of Europe. But if we look at the reverse way, what is the European ova of Islam? And here we have a big contradiction, because the discourse on the contradiction between Europe and Islam is itself contradictory. What are the European values? Usually, when you listen to politicians, French, Belgian, Germans, Dutch, or from the people of the Brussels Commission, you have the same discourse. Europe, the European values are values of freedom, tolerance, of feminist values. We acknowledge gay rights, etc., etc. And the Muslims don't. That's the discourse you hear. But then you have a second discourse in Europe to oppose Islam. The discourse is Europe is Christian. Well, there is a big problem because most of the practicing Christians, and especially the Catholics and the Protestant evangelicals, they are not feminist. They don't support gay marriage. They don't support abortion. They are very conservative in terms of family, sexuality, gender issues, and so on and so on. Exactly like, practicing Muslims. So the practicing Muslims are closer to the practicing Christians in Europe if we consider the debate on values. And I think it's why the debate is so, it's a dead end. Because it's not, the issue is not what is Islam. The issue is what is Europe? How do we define Europe? And we are shifting, permanently shifting, between two definitions. One as, the liberal Europe in terms of values, which in fact is not the old Europe. It's the Europe of the 60s, or at least, let's say, the post-war Europe, the post-Second World War Europe. The Europe which has been constructed against Nazism, against communism, against fascism. This Europe is liberal, and this Europe is in favor of human rights. And in the 60s, we had a change of, I would say, values concerning sexual freedom, family, feminism, and so on and so on. So the liberal Europe that we oppose now to supposedly conservative Islam is a very recent Europe. It's a Europe of the post-50s, which is very little if we compare to the centuries of European history. And most of the people who claim, who oppose a Christian identity to Europe are not practicing Christian. That's something which is very funny. If you listen to Thilo Sarrazin in Germany, to Eric Zemmour in France, to Welbeck, and so on and so on, all these people have the nostalgia of a Christian Europe, but none of them is going to Mass. None of them is a believing or practicing Christian. And the church, the Catholic Church, has no difficulty to say, let's be coherent. If you are Christian, you should follow the Christian values. And you should go to church. Don't speak in our name, in the name of Christianity, if you don't follow the norms and values of the Catholic Church. It's a message which has been sent, for instance, to European populists by Cardinal Schönborn in Austria, by Cardinal Marx in Bavaria, when the extreme right use Christian symbols like the cross, to say we don't want Islam. The two cardinals said, you don't have the right to use the cross. You cannot use the cross if you don't follow the values. And as far as Christian values are concerned, we, the church, we know better. So either you follow the church or you don't use the cross. So you see this contradiction. And it's a profound contradiction. It's not a contradiction you can solve, by an open discussion. Why is it a difficult issue? I will go back to what I said at the beginning. To understand, the issue of Islam in Europe, we have to understand the relationship between Europe and religion. And here, to go quite briefly, I will mainly concentrate on Western Europe, not on Orthodox or Ottoman Europe. The history is different. Yeah. I will speak about Catholic Europe. Catholic in the Middle Age, Europe was Catholic. And the Catholic Church was the first European institution. From the 12th to the 15th century, the only European institution was the Catholic Church. They had, a bureaucracy. They had their teaching places, the universities. They had their language, Latin. They had their government, the leader, the Pope. And they didn't care about nationality. as long as you are a priest and you speak in Latin, it doesn't matter if you come from Scotland, from Italy, from Poland, it doesn't matter. So the first transnational, there was no nation at that time, but the first transnational European institution was the Catholic Church. And I would say that the idea of a united Europe is first a Catholic idea. Don't forget that the founding fathers of Europe were, for most of them, practicing Catholics. Schumann, de Gasperi, Adenauer, and so on. They were Christian Democrats who allied with Social Democrats. It was an alliance of these two parties. And the Catholic side brought a long experience of, supranational moral and political governance of Europe. That's something very important. But this first, European institution, the Catholic Church, broke in the 16th century because of the Reformation. And the Reformation brought civil war to Europe. It was a civil war. The wars of religion were civil wars. It was not a war between Christianity and Islam. It was a war between Christians and about the definition of Christianity. These religious wars have shaped modern Europe. In which sense? It gave birth to the absolute state, the nation state. The Treaty of Westphalia in 1648 had, not invented, but given legitimacy and power to the nation state. And specifically, the Treaty of Westphalia entitled the states to control religion, whatever is the religion. So this is the European model of managing religion. Religion is state control. Religion is organized in a national framework. It's new. It's the 17th century, something new, but it's something very strong. And each nation defined differently its relations with religion. So as I said, you had some national state church, you had some pillars, as the Dutch says, religion recognized as legal entities. You had separation, and which was very strong in France, because in France it was a conflictual separation between state and church, not a negotiated separation. So the problem is when the European states decided to build Europe, what to do with religion. And the first decision taken, by the way, by using Catholic's legal concept, subsidiarity, is that Brussels should not interfere with some issues, topics, problems, which should be managed by the national state. And religion is one of these issues. Regularly, the European Court of Human Rights, when some people do complain about religious freedom, the European Court of Human Rights never decide on the rule for religion. It always decides on individual infringement of freedom of religion, but never on the relations between states and religion. That's something important. It's managed by the European Court of Human Rights as an individual issue, a problem of individual citizens confronted with the state, the national state. So there is nothing to expect from the European Court of Human Rights in terms of thinking religion in Europe. So we have to rely on these different European historical experiences. And another point here is precisely what do we call secularization? Everybody in Europe will agree that Europe is secular. The church itself acknowledges, maybe reluctantly, but acknowledges that Europe is secular. The Catholic Church, the different Protestant churches, they all recognize that the faith communities, including the Christian faith communities, are minorities. The people who regularly practice religion, who regularly go to the mass, are in a minority, except in Poland. But even in Poland, the number of people attending masses is decreasing. So, what we call secularization is first a political and legal principle, separation of church and state, or organization of religion by the state. So when, for instance, the English king, Henry VIII, decided to create an English national church, the Anglican Church, and he decided that he will be the head of the church, it means that the church is under a secular control, that the church has been politically secularized by the state. And even now, the Queen Elizabeth is still the head of the Anglican Church. Nobody will consider the Queen as a theologian or as a priest. It doesn't make sense, you know. She is the Queen of England. Because she is the Queen of England, she is the head of the Anglican Church. That's all, you know. So it means, in a sense, a secularization of the church. So even in the best example are in the Scandinavian states. In most of these Scandinavian states, you have a state church or a people's church. It's the way it's called in Denmark. But the number of people going to church is one of the lowest in Europe. So it has no relationship. You know, you can have a national church, but it doesn't mean that the people are believers or practicing. So secularization is this control of the churches by the state, or separation of the churches and the state. But it's always the political which decides. The last, you know, way of recourse is the political. It's always the parliament, the state, which win when there is a conflict. And this conflict can be tough. You know. Don't forget that in Italy, just 150 years ago, the army, the national army, took the Vatican by force. They besieged Rome, and they took the Vatican by force, and they destroyed what was remaining of the political power of the Catholic Church. So we have a political secularization. In France, the political secularization was the law of 1905, when the Republic decided, you know, two principles: separation of church and state, and neutrality of the state. So it was not an anti-religious law. The law did stress freedom of religion. There was freedom of religion, and freedom not just of religious belief, but of religious practices. It meant that the Catholics had the right to ring bells under some conditions. They had the right to have processions in the streets. Yeah? They had the right to have public prayers, but always with the authorization of the political authorities, the state, the mayor, the préfet, and so on and so on. They always need an authorization, but it was allowed. And at that time, which is very interesting, you know, as I said, we had two strongly anti-clerical national states in Europe, and maybe three with Spain, the beginning, in Europe, France and Italy. But both countries had a huge Catholic majority. The huge majority of the population used to go to the Mass every Sunday. But the power did fight and won the fight against the Catholic Church. In Switzerland, it's the same. It's very not well known. But we had a religious war in the 50s. The Protestant cantons defeated the Catholic cantons. And the Jesuits were expelled. from Switzerland, although the Swiss population was Christian and practicing Christians. So that I come to my second point here. Secularization is not necessarily dechristianization. You can have a secular country from a political and legal point of view and a Christian population. But the problem, if it's a problem, I don't know, is that it's not the case. What happened in the mid-20th century is a dechristianization of Europe and a strong dechristianization. What do I call dechristianization? That the religious practice just fell. People stopped to go to the mass. Young people stopped to go to be trained to be a priest in Christian seminaries. The Christian schooling system stopped to be Christian. And the church itself became, I would say, in a minority and lost most of its political influence. The most dramatic case is Ireland. In 20 years, Ireland went from a Catholic state and nation to a secular state and nation. Catholic has Ireland allowed abortion, same-sex marriage against the church, and the practices and training for priests is crumbling everywhere. And the last strike was the 60s. The revolution, the cultural revolution of the 60s, had simple consequence. The dominant values in Europe stopped to be secularized Christian values. Until the mid-20th century, in every European country, the dominant secular values were secularized Christian values. For instance, the definition of the marriage, the definition of gender, the ban on abortion, the vision of procreation, the definition of what is bad or good in sexual life, and so on. So all that were secularized Christian values. And suddenly in the 60s, these secularized Christian values disappeared and were replaced by what we call now the liberal values of Europe. Individual rights, feminism, gay rights, freedom of choice about everything from sexuality to procreation and so and gender. Okay. A total change. The Catholic Church immediately understood the revolution. In 1968, Pope Paul VI issued the encyclical Humanae Vitae, which pushed for a strict, Christian conservative definition of sexuality. It's the first encyclicum letter on sexuality in the history of the Catholic Church. Because in the 60s, sexuality became the place where the new values were, I would say, acknowledged, experienced, and defined. So, in the 60s, we can say Europe stopped to be Christian, either in terms of practices or in terms of values. And it's exactly in the 60s that Islam came with the huge population of Muslim labor migrants. And it's in the 60s that Europe as an institution, resource, started to be real. So we have these three revolutions coming together in the 60s with no link between themselves. And as I said, the coming of Islam was not first perceived as a coming of a new religion. It was perceived as an issue of ethnicity, race, migration, and so on, not a religious issue. At the end of the 80s, we have the change. The issue is Islam as a religion. And now the problem is how to manage Islam as a religion at a time when Christianity as a religion disappeared from the landscape. Not from the landscape, because the landscape is still Christian. We have many churches, crosses, symbols, Christian symbols everywhere. But the churches are empty. And interesting enough, in most of the European countries, the first issue was precisely about signs, religious signs. The veil, the minaret, the mosque, the burqa, or halal food, and so, the fact, for instance, that in some restaurants or in some canteens, you had a tag with halal food. So it was more symbolic than anything else. But symbols are very important, as we know. And what the states used to do, and are still doing, was to regulate the religious signs in the public sphere. Once again, France was first. The first issue was in 1989, when two second-generation school girls came, to the school with scarves. Not the traditional veil. They had a modern dress. They were native French speakers. They were good at school. So it was not, a cultural difference. It was not a backward culture. No. They were fully integrated, except that they wanted to be considered as practicing Muslims, not as Arabs, but as practicing Muslims. And so they came with a scarf. The head of the school expelled them, and then there was a big fuss, which was which gave birth to a law, the law of 2004, banning religious signs from the schools. And here we have something very important. It's not banning the Muslim scarf. It's banning religious signs. So which means that every religion was concerned by the ban. In fact, the ban was motivated only by Islam. We had other religious signs at school. Some school children used to wear kippah, yarmulka, Jewish kippah. Few chaplains, because chaplains were not forbidden in the schools. They were allowed, but not during school times. Some chaplains, Catholic chaplains, used to have a cassock, a black Catholic cassock. Some Sikh, Indian Sikh, used to wear a turban. Boys wear a turban. There was no problem. The problem was the scarf, the veil. But what was the option for the state? To ban only the veil would not have been constitutional. It would have been a discrimination between religions. So the only solution was to ban all the religious signs, knowing that in fact the people who will be mainly impacted were the Muslims. Because Sikh wearing a turban, I think we had 12 in France, 12. Catholic chaplains with a cassock, maybe 3 or 4 in France. Jewish boys with a kippah, they were instructed by their own rabbis not to wear the kippah. Rabbis say, okay, keep a low profile. Don't wear the kippah. So it was not an issue with the religious authorities, except with the Sikh religious authorities, but in France there is no Sikh religious authorities, so it's not a problem. But what the law did is acknowledging the expulsion of religion from the public space as a religion. And that's something which is totally new, because the law of separation doesn't expel religion from the public space. The law on separation allows religion to be present either symbolically, for instance, buildings, churches, crosses along the roads, statues, things like that was allowed. But suddenly, the idea was religion has no more place in the public space. And that's my main point, that in order to control Islam, France, but also most of the European states, are taking a path to accentuate the secularization of Europe, the cultural secularization of Europe, the social secularization of Europe. Most of the European states now are trying to push religion into the private, which was never in the law. The fact that religion is private is something that we could have heard in communist countries, okay, except in Albania. But in other communist countries, yeah, the idea that we don't care about if you pray at home, we don't care. But don't speak religion outside home, don't pray in the street, don't wear a cross, etc., etc. Except in Poland, where the communist state had to accept a certain presence of the Catholic Church in the public space. But in Western Europe, what we have now is a slow expulsion of religion from the public space. And it's largely connected with the will to curb Islamic visibility. But it's larger than that. The crisis of pedophilia in the Catholic Church had for consequence to weaken the church, of course, but also had as a consequence an increased control of the state on Catholic practices. I give you an example. It's not yet decided, but many members of parliament here and there in Europe want the state to control confessions. And in Australia, it's not in Europe, but in Australia, for instance, the secret of confessions have been abolished by the local parliament. Officially, it means to oblige the church to go to police when they know something about a crime, a sexual crime. Okay, so it's a good reason. But confession is central to the Catholic faith and practice. It's a condition of salvation. So you have a direct intervention of a secular state into theological practices. And it's not just about Islam. Let's, for instance, take an example in France today. The government says that jihadism is a consequence of radicalization of religion, or more exactly, is a consequence of religious radicalization. The development of Salafi theology, which is spreading among the youth, and which pushes the youth to become more radical in political terms and to become violent. So the state said we have to control the teaching of Muslim religion, of Muslim theology. How to do that? In a state where you have separation of religion and state. And it's the case in all Europe. Nowhere in Europe, a state can tell a church or a faith community what they should think about salvation. Even the Queen of England cannot say, oh, I have a new idea about sin and salvation, and I can tell you that God loves homosexuals. No, she cannot say that. She may think that, that's another story, but she cannot say it, and she cannot oblige the church to implement that. But the paradox is that it's what the states are doing with Islam. They are trying to develop European Islam. or a liberal Islam, or sometimes even a feminist Islam. Okay. The problem is, could a religion be liberal in theological terms? Could you have a democratic religion? If you believe in a transcendental God who has sent to the mankind his laws, then you cannot say, okay, let's debate democratically the will of God. So what is interesting is that the states are trying to find ways to bypass, their own constitutional legitimacy, which is secularism. So in France, the state has pushed, Muslim leaders who are not imams, who are not clerics, but who are leaders of local communities and so, to establish the French Council of Muslim Faith. And they've pushed them to write, a charter of Islam, saying that Islam recognizes the gender equality. And the idea is that, okay, once they will accept that, we'll find a way to oblige the imams to sign the charter. The problem is that it's totally against the constitution. It's against the European Constitution. And it will have an impact on the other religion. If, for instance, the state succeeds in imposing, the Muslim imams in France to recognize gender equality, what do we do with the Catholic Church? What do we do if one day a baptized, believing Christian woman comes to the court, the state court, and says, I've been rejected. My candidacy to becoming a bishop has been rejected by the church. It's a scandal. It's a discrimination. I want the church to be condemned by the court. Yeah. What do we do? Either we accept that, okay, gender equality doesn't apply to the Catholic Church, so it doesn't apply to any religion. Or we say, oh yes, the Catholic Church should appoint sometimes at least one female bishop. Problem. And same for the Jewish rabbinate, same from evangelical Protestants, same for Orthodox churches. So good luck. Good luck. And in this case, how can we pretend to have a Christian identity? So if the what we see now is an endeavor by all the European states to rethink the place of religion in Europe in order either to expel Islam or to formate Islam into a European religion. I'm not saying that most of the states want to get rid of Islam. Most of them would like to formate Islam. It's a term that I use in my book, Holy Ignorance, formatting a religion. By pushing this religion into the existing framework of the already present religion. In a way, to Protestantize religion. Or to make them Catholic. For instance, when we try in France and in Austria also, and so, to have an authority representing the Muslims, well, what we try to do is to create a Muslim church on the model of a Catholic church, which is a total nonsense. But the dream of the state is to have a church and to negotiate with the church a new concordate. The problem is the concordate is no more the framework of the relationship between state and religion in Europe. And a concordate is not democratic by definition. It's a negotiation between leaders to oblige believers to follow the rules. Already, many Protestant churches in Europe said that they will never accept the idea that the state should regulate churches. They will not accept. The evangelicals, for instance, are very opposed to this idea that they should agree to values. So we have now a very strange landscape, totally different from the USA. In the USA, the populist right is Christian and defends Christian values. The populist right is fighting same-sex marriage, is fighting abortion, is promoting Christian values and norms, more norms than values, by the way. Okay. But in Europe, the populists are not promoting Christian values at all. The populists in Europe, most of them, they have endorsed abortion, they have endorsed same-sex marriage, they have endorsed sexual freedom, and they do practice sexual freedom. You have no difference between a populist politician and a leftist politician. If we take the case of France now, politically, the society is going to the right, clearly. But in terms of values, the society is going to the left. There are more and more support for same-sex marriage and for artificial procreation, more and more support. So the same people who are becoming more liberal in terms of values are becoming more conservative in political terms, which means that we have no clear political expression of what we call the Christian identity of Europe, or of what we call the liberal values of Europe. And this is a big problem. The debate is not reflected in the political field. In France, all the parties, almost all the parties, are fighting to have more secularism. We do not have one party saying, no, we should have more freedom of religion. Even the conservative Catholics are unable, to have a political influence. They lost the last time when the Conservative Rightist Party appointed, a practicing Catholic as the head of the list for the parliamentary election, Mr. Bellamy. They made 8%, which is nothing for a party with the party of President Chirac and Nicolas Sarkozy, and so it's nothing. So they lost. And the problem of the Muslims is that either they follow, what is expected for them, so they create some sort of Muslim institution, and they negotiate on values and norms with the different governments. But in this case, they might lose their followers. Because there is no Muslim community in Europe. There is a Muslim population, not a Muslim community. And for the first generation, the cleavages between Turks, Moroccans, Pakistanis is still very strong. And for the second and third generation, it's not a matter of ethnicity, but it's a matter of churches. Born-again Muslims don't accept the liberal values of Europe. And here they're closer to the evangelicalists and to the evangelicals and to the Catholic right. So we have a very complex landscape. And nobody is mastering the game. That's the big problem. And to end on, I don't know if it's a more optimistic note, almost 20 years ago, I told my government and people in Brussels, but we have a model of European Islam, because there is at least one country where there is a tradition of separation of state law and of a Muslim community, which its own institutions and researchers, theologians, so that's Bastia, The Faculty of Theology in Sarajevo is a creation of the Emperor Franz Joseph. So it's a state creation, exactly in the line of Westphalian spirit. The state does recognize and support different religions. So there was state recognition of Islam, which is still officially here in Austria. There is a faculty of theology, which has been confronted from the beginning, with secularization, communism, dechristianization, anti-religious attitudes, nationalism, and so on and so on. So they know, they have a tradition of dealing with concrete, contemporary European problems, but nobody is calling them. What are doing our states? They call the Moroccan government, they call the Turkish government, they call the Egyptian government, the Algerian government, to manage an Islam which is sociologically becoming more and more European, because now we have second and third generations who have European languages as the first language, and who are totally European educated, even if they undertake a return to religion, which is never a return to traditional forms of religion, but always, the creation of new forms of religion, sometimes liberal, sometimes fundamentalist. That's another story. But we don't address this issue. What are the religious needs of the Muslim youth in Europe? That's the real problem. The problem is not immigration. The problem is not Moroccan Islam or Turkish Islam and so on and so on. It's the new spiritual needs. And the spiritual needs of the Muslim youth is not very different from the spiritual needs of all the youth today. In Catholicism, in Protestantism, we have also this wave of born again. And we have converts, which is a topic which has always been underestimated. We have converts from Christianity or atheism to Islam among the youth. And we have converts from Islam to Christianity, also among the youth. So now we have what I call the deculturation of religion in favor of the setting up of purely faith communities. So we have to acknowledge this. We can like it or not, that's not the issue. To acknowledge this, and we have to treat religion as religion, and not as a side effect of other phenomena like immigration or cultural wars, or what you want. We have de facto European Muslims, and now we have to construct a European Islam from these European Muslims. Thank you.